In Pete Alonso's first media session of 2024, he reiterated that he wants to be a lifelong Met. If that's the case, why aren't these two sides talking contract extension? I'll break it all down on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers who join today will get $150 in bonus bets. Your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Pete Alonso showed up to camp. He sat in front of the media. It's funny, you see a lot of these players getting interviewed for the first time in the clubhouse. No, Pete has to go to the media room because everyone wants to talk to him, and he's got to field about 17 minutes of questions about whether he's going to be a Met for the rest of his career, which is something that is pretty much completely out of his control right now. Now, that media session to me was painful to watch because Pete Alonso has a responsibility to his family and to himself, really, to make sure he gets a fair market value contract. Pete Alonso also chose to be represented by Scott Boras, who is going to make sure he is going to get that market value contract. Because of those things, the player is often painted as the person that is causing the problem in this type of a situation. He's greedy. He wants, to get paid more than anyone else. He wants to get paid more than Freddie Freeman. Pete could just say, well, I've gone out year over year, been an absolute professional, and put up my numbers. And when he gets to free agency, Scott Boras is going to say, Pete Alonso has led Major League Baseball since his debut in home runs and RBIs. He is the best run producer in the game. And he's going to shop that around, and he'll probably get at least something close to whatever contract number they set out there. If they set to surpass Freddie Freeman's contract when it comes to AAV, which was $27 million, they'll probably get that. If it's about passing, who's number one? I think maybe Matt Olson got a little bit more in total value. Bryce Harper now technically counts as a first base contract, but he signed that as an outfielder. So maybe it's getting the first $200 million contract for a first baseman. I guess Miguel Cabrera had one as well. Regardless, whatever record they aim to break, whatever figure they're trying to get, he'll probably get close to that if he goes into free agency. But he also wants to be a Met. And here are the things that he said that reiterates that point that he wants to be a New York Met. He said, I love it here. He said, I definitely envision being a lifelong Met. That's something I've definitely thought about. I love New York. It's a really special place for me and my family. He just goes on and on about it. And they keep asking him the same question. And the good thing is we did get some interesting tidbits, but man, is that a tough position he has to be in and has to consistently be in, because it's not Scott Boras that's to talk to the media. It's not even David Stearns that's to talk to the media, or Steve Cohen nearly as much as Pete Alonso, who's going to have a microphone in his face after every single game. Or if not every single game, a lot of them, at least multiple times a week. And I hope that this story dies at some point. I hope that it's not a constant thing. Oh, Pete, you played pretty well at Wrigley Field this week. You ever thought about playing for them? I hope it's not that, but that very well could become a running storyline throughout the season. And man, it's going to get tired. And look, here I am talking about Pete Alonso's contract again on this show. And I've done this time and again over the last, 5 years, literally. Now, every time in the past that I talked about a contract extension, it was making sure you sign him before he gets close to free agency, because then you don't have the leverage to get a good deal done. And that's where the Mets are at. It is a really tough place to be in. But Pete Alonso's not making it any easier on them, because when it comes to the questions about his contract situation, when asked about a long-term deal, he said, the only contract discussion we've had this offseason was on my salary, the one-year deal for this season through arbitration. He obviously didn't get to arbitration. They agreed to a 1 year, $20.5 million deal. So that was the one contract detail that was discussed. Anything long-term was never broached, according to Alonso, which I believe is probably true. Now, Scott Boras at the winter meeting said they are all ears. They are listening because I'm sure Pete Alonso told Scott Boras he would love to sign an extension with the New York Mets. The problem is getting market value. What does market value mean to Scott Boras and Pete Alonso? What does market value mean to the New York Mets? And if those two sides got in a room, could they ever find a middle ground right now? And it's really tough because, you know, as a fan, you just want to say, all right, sign the guy. And the fact that he is saying he is all ears, it makes you really feel for the guy and say, well, why aren't they talking? Right? Because he's saying, we're listening. They asked him about Francisco Lindor, who signed his contract extension in 2021. And it was a great question. It might have been Anthony Tacoma. Regardless, the question basically was Francisco Lindor set a deadline for opening day to discuss contract. And if they didn't get a deal done, he was going to focus on baseball for the season. Now, Lindor had the fact that he was just traded for kind of in his back pocket, that the Mets did not want to lose the guy. They just gave up some talented players, Andres Jimenez being the most notable one, who has turned himself into a platinum glove winner in Cleveland. They didn't want to lose him for nothing. He set that deadline. It worked. He got the contract. He's lived up to the contract. But that's how that situation resolved itself. Pete Alonso said, I'm not setting a deadline for opening day. So in some ways, that's great. He's all ears throughout the season. In other ways, it keeps this story going. It's not as simple as David Stern saying, hey, we'll let this thing play out. He's going to play out this year. We can absolutely sign him in free agency. Alonso keeps the conversation going by saying it's not just an opening day thing. They're listening, but no one's talking to them. And it's a really weird spot to be in for the franchise right now, because here's a guy that wants to be a lifelong Met, represented by a guy that's going to make sure he doesn't take a penny less than his market value. So he wants to be a lifelong Met, but not necessarily on a hometown discount. So there isn't incentive necessarily to sign him now, instead of just waiting a year and seeing what his market will be and where you'll be at as a franchise. But at the same time, the pressure is on you because he's letting this fan base that loves him know that he wants to stick around and he would be willing to sign a deal. It just, again, comes down to what does that deal look like? And like I said, this has been a topic on this show for years. And you can go back on September, I think it was 21st, look up Pete Alonso contract or scroll through the old episodes. You'll find one back in September where I talked about it. I think it was based on the fact that he wanted a 10-year deal. At least at the time, there was some report that came out about that. And I broke down exactly what a contract could look like. But you just don't know what they want in this situation and how these two sides come together at this juncture. It just seems unlikely. But to not even try also doesn't feel like the Mets are doing their due diligence. Because maybe there is some wiggle room. Maybe you could get a deal done. They always make it seem like Scott Boras will never sign an extension with one of his players, or will never accept a contract extension with one of his players. But Jose Altuve just got one from the Astros. Different situation. A guy whose legacy is really tied to Houston in a very singular way. He's won championships there. Alonso very much is a New York Met, but he's still earlier in his career. Altuve has signed extensions in the past. So they got a deal done. He was a year away from free agency. They made sure he's a lifelong Astro. If Alonso has made it clear to Scott Boras that is what he wants, there is, still a motivation from the agent to get a deal done for his player. It just has to be the right price. So I want to go through that a little bit, that give and take, what that could look like, and why the Mets would not even talk about an extension. That's the thing. If he's saying they're all ears, but the Mets have only talked about this one-year deal, why aren't they at all trying to broach the topic? Why aren't they getting in a room with Scott Boras and just seeing what's possible? We'll break that all down in just a minute. First, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 if your bet wins. You can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive props, and more. And also with the MLB season coming up, how about MLB futures? Want to bet on Pete Alonso in his contract year to win the MVP? You could do that. Or maybe it's Kodai Senga to win the Cy Young, or just the Mets as a team to make the playoffs. All of that can be found over at FanDuel. And if, again, remember, if you place that $5 bet and you win, you're going to get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Now, the interesting thing about Pete Alonso's stance that he made to the media on his contract situation is that he expressed interest to remain with the Mets. He said they are willing to listen to any offers, but they're not necessarily pursuing the Mets on an extension. And the media pressed him on that. Honestly, I think Alonso could have answered that better and just saying, no, I can't offer myself a contract. The Mets have to come to me, right? And I think in that sense, he's absolutely correct. The Mets have to open the dialogue. It's not on Scott Boras to say, hey, Pete really wants to sign. He did enough of that by speaking to the media at the winter meetings and saying that they would listen. The Mets are in a position right now where they don't want to extend Pete Alonso. They don't believe that they're going to be able to get a deal better than the one they might get 12 months from now or 10 months from now when he hits free agency. And they're willing to let this thing play out because you know what? They're going to know a lot more about their team. And a year from now, who else is a free agent? Juan Soto, another Scott Boras client. And it's even less likely that he signs a deal with the Yankees. So he's going to hit the market at 26 years old. And not that these guys play the same position because Soto's an outfielder, Alonso's a first baseman. But in a larger sense, if you think about a long-term deal, they do play the same position because their position is hitter. Juan Soto is a better hitter than Pete Alonso. He just is. Alonso has more power. He might drive in more runs. But Juan Soto walks at an exorbitant rate. He hits for a higher average. He is just a more complete hitter. By every advanced metric you want to look at, Juan Soto is a better hitter than Pete Alonso. Pete Alonso's great. Drives in runs, hits home runs. I love Pete. But if you had to pick between the two hitters, you're going to take Juan Soto. Now, how much are you prioritizing that now, a year away from free agency? I don't think this is all about Juan Soto, but it's about keeping your options open. It's about seeing, oh, is Mark Vientos actually a really good hitter? Could he be your first baseman? It's about seeing, all right, Drew Gilbert, Jet Williams, Luis Angel Acuna. How are these guys filtering in through the farm system and up to the big leagues? Who's playing at each spot? What's your team look like? If the Mets think that the deal right now is pretty much identical to what they would have to pay a year from now, might as well wait this thing out and see what happens. And I think that's the stance that the Mets have taken here. We waited too long. We're not going to get some hometown discount. So we're better off just not even broaching the subject. And while I think that that's probably the correct way to do business, I also think if Pete Alonso is telling the media that his side will listen, he wants to be a Met, it's worth it to at least get in a room to set up a meeting with Scott Boras at some point at the end of spring training and just see where their heads are at. Because if anything, it'll inform you next offseason. And I think you can have that meeting and not have it bleed into the season if you do it in spring training. But are the Mets even willing to entertain anything right now? To me, I think it's silly to not have a conversation. But this conversation could end quickly. Scott Boras says Pete Alonso wants $300 million. Then you say, all right, well, let's see what his market is in a year from now. If he says we want to have a bigger contract than Miguel Cabrera's, which I just looked up, and it was $240 million on an 8-year deal, and just want to surpass the total value, and they set that mark at $250 million. All right, well, how can you get there? 10-year deal, and you include one of those years being this year's $20.5 million. So then it's a 9-year deal at whatever that is, $229.5 million. Is that something that the Mets would consider? Is that more than he would get in free agency? Let's do the math on this real quick. 229, we'll just call it 230, right? Round numbers. Divide that by 9. That's an AAV of $25.5 million. That's not crazy. Now, the years might be. So the Mets maybe take it down a year, but then it's not a contract that surpasses Miguel Cabrera's total value. It's not a contract that surpasses Freddie Freeman's AAV record of $27 million. How do you come to terms? Deferrals. We've seen it, right? Because the Mets defer money in Pete Alonso's deals. That's something that these sides will be willing to negotiate. Max Scherzer took deferrals from the Nationals. Who was his agent? Oh, yeah, Scott Boras. And again, you never know. Boras, at the end of the day, we do forget that he does work for the player. So if the player makes it very clear, and Scott says, hey, Pete, they actually want to talk about a contract extension. We're going to meet with them. Pete says, I would really want to get a deal done. And they talk about the parameters they're looking for. There is a world where this could happen. But the Mets had to pursue it on the front end of it. They can't just expect Scott Boras to pursue them and knock on the door and say, hey, please give us an extension. That's what Pete wants. Because that ruins their leverage. The Mets can play a coy, and that might be good for their own leverage. And maybe it does just make sense to let this thing play out. I did a show last week talking about what a massive contract year looks like for Pete Alonso. I'm excited to see it. I'm excited to see him try to go out there and earn that money because I think that motivation could propel the Mets. And that could end up helping them make the playoffs and could end up being the best thing for the 2024 New York Mets for Pete Alonso to play with a chip on his shoulder. So I see every single side of this thing. But if you look at the Aaron Judge situation of a couple of years ago, they let that thing play out. He put up an MVP season. It was great for them, but they did not win the World Series. And now he's on a much, much richer contract than he would have been if they talked extension a year prior. And you could say, oh, he wouldn't have had that contract year if they didn't talk. But also, he'd still probably be something close to the same player under a better deal for a long time, which would have in turn been better for the franchise. I think if you look at contract deferrals, length of the deal, or maybe you give Pete Alonso an 11-year contract that is front-loaded. Maybe there's options in a contract that are attractive. Maybe there's incentives. I do believe that you might still be able to sign him to a better contract now than you will in a year. Because if he does everything he's supposed to and he puts up a 50 home run season, it might cost a lot more. And you want to sign Juan Soto, hey, maybe it's more attractive for the New York Mets to negotiate with Juan Soto having Pete Alonso already locked up. You want Pete Alonso to hit behind you for the next 8 years? Maybe that gets you a little bit closer on another free agent. So again, I really do see each side of this thing. But I think the Mets would be negligent to not at least have a conversation with Scott Boras on Pete Alonso when it feels like Pete Alonso is sort of begging them to. We're listening. That Scott Boras had to go to the media and say they're listening. That was not just something he did without Pete Alonso putting in a request. And Pete says, I want to be a lifelong Met. We know how much Pete Alonso wants to stay with this franchise. He doesn't want to go somewhere else. But if you never approach him about a contract, he plays out this year and it is a bad year for the Mets. And then you go into free agency and you are just all hot and heavy pursuing Juan Soto and you have Pete on the back burner. All of a sudden, that love for the New York Mets might go away and he might sign with another team. And then who knows? Juan Soto might also sign with another team. And you might be left with neither of them. And it's only Francisco Lindor and Brandon Nimmo as the star players on your team in 2025 with all of the youth coming up. And who knows? That might be fine for the Mets. They might find their way. But with less and less players hitting free agency because everyone is signing these pre-arbitration contracts, I do think it's worth it to at least broach the subject and see what happens. Regardless, though, this is a complete wait and see situation, and there's no way of knowing what's going to happen here because I'll tell you one thing. David Stearns is not going to be talking about any contract negotiations. I don't think Scott Boras would bring that to public either unless, I don't know, there was some angle he can use on that front. But ultimately, if conversations happen, they probably happen behind closed doors. And unless a report comes out, we most likely don't hear anything. And I think because the Mets are sitting in this situation where they don't have a ton of leverage, and there are so many benefits of letting this thing play out and letting Pete get to free agency because they'll have so much more knowledge on their team, their future, what they need, how they can best build a roster. Nothing probably gets done. I just think a conversation should be had. But that's all for Pete Alonso's contract for now. I'm going to try to stay away from the topic. I don't want to be the same media that's out there, beating this subject into the ground. But Pete's answers were too interesting for me to not discuss it. So there you have it. We're going to get into some other news and notes from Mets camp, a couple minor league signs to discuss, some kind of notable names, and Starling Marte showing up healthy. We'll break that all down in just a minute. First, though, today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience are what brings home the winning trophy. It also keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. 122 million parts for your car or truck. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. All the parts you need at the prices you want. It's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay's guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. Speaking of first basemen, the New York Mets signed a couple of them over the weekend to potentially back up Pete at first, more likely to spend the season in Syracuse. They got G-Man Choi and Luke Voit. Now, Choi is maybe the better of the two in the sense that he got a split contract. At least that's what was reported, where he'd make over $3 million, I believe, if he actually got on the opening day roster. Really think this is competition for DJ Stewart more than it is for Mark Vientos. It's the left-handed bat that would be on your bench. And Choi has had a really solid career, has a 764 career OPS. His OPS plus for his career is 112. OPS plus is another one of those stats that measures hitters on a league average of 100. It's a league adjusted stat. So a 112 OPS plus means throughout his career, he's been a hitter that's 12% better than league average. Typically, that OPS plus has ranged. I mean, there was one season where it was 135 in 2018, where he was split between the Brewers and the Rays being the bigger part of that, slugged over 500 that year. Was really great with the Rays, honestly, that season. It was a 141 OPS plus with them, 8 home runs, 12 doubles, 1 triple in 49 games. So he's had stints where he's been solid. You look at his Rays career overall, he had 245, 352 on base, 431 slug, 783 OPS. That was across parts of 5 seasons. Now, last year, he wasn't good. Okay, he hit 205 with the Pirates in 23 games. He did hit 6 home runs, though, with 4 doubles, so his slug was over 500. Ends up on the Padres after the deadline. Was a disaster in 16 games. Only got 2 hits and 31 at-bats. Hit .065. Got on base at a 268 clip. Didn't slug at all. So, I mean, small sample size. Wasn't very good. We'll see what he brings this year. If he made the team, it would be off of a great spring. He's 32 years old, will turn 33 in May. I wouldn't expect much from G-Man Choi, but it's good depth to have, right? If something happens to Pete Alonso or at DH, you need some options. And it's at least a guy that's been playing big league baseball over the last couple of years. And, it is a very good 4A player, if nothing else. And speaking of that, Luke Voit, he put up ridiculous numbers in Syracuse last year. So he hit 15 home runs. Let me pull up the exact stats. But 15 home runs for Syracuse in 45 games. Hit 263, got on base at a 420 clip, slugged at a 615 clip, so his OPS was 1.035. He had 43 RBIs in 45 games. Now, with that said, in the big leagues with the Brewers in 22 games, he had a 548 OPS. So, again, not necessarily a guy I expect much out of. For Voit, that is a little bit more competition for Mark Vientos, as the lefty masher who, can DH for you. But I'd be very surprised if he makes the team either. I think these are two guys who might be platooning with each other in Syracuse, maybe getting some time at DH too over first base and DH, some type of a split there. But I don't think they're going to play huge roles for the Mets this season. We'll probably see one of them for a couple weeks stint at some point or another, but don't get too worked up about either signing. Starling Marte, though, showed up to camp, and he said he is healthy enough to play 170 games this year, which is a great quote. Let me actually look at the career high games played for Starling Marte, because I'm sure he has never even gotten close to 170, because for one, there's 162 games in a season, but that would really depend on the playoff success that the Pirates had in some of those years. I'm looking at 2015. He had 153 games played in the regular season, one playoff game. 2013, 6 playoff games, 135 regular season. So yeah, never gotten even over 160, I don't believe. Last time he played over 140 was in 2018. So his whole point is he's trying to say he's completely healthy, he's full go, which is amazing. When asked about DHing this year, he said he likes to be in the field. He likes to be able to help out the pitcher, making every play that he can out there. To me, I think DH is a good spot for him this year, not full time, but to get him off his feet. And I'm sure they'll communicate that point to him in a proper way. And maybe that just allows his bat to stay in the lineup. But I am excited that he is that confident about his health. I did a show a couple weeks back when he was, maybe a month ago at this point, when he was tearing up the Dominican Winter League at the start, how a healthy Starling Marte could be massive in the Mets this year. He really is one of those X factor players. If you take last season and you just believe he was not right at all, he was trying to push through injuries, and you got the worst version of himself because of that, well, you hope that there's still the 2022 guy that's in there, and that guy was an all-star. So if you have Starling Marte playing at that level, for one, it gives you a better option to stick in the 2-hole where you can space out your lineup and lengthen it, because I think Jeff McNeil hitting a little bit lower down the line would be good for the Mets in the sense that, you could, if you are going to keep Nimmo at 1, but it really does lengthen that lineup to where past Alonso, you have some more established hitters than just completely trusting the youth movement with Alvarez and Beatty and Vientos, or guys that are more in the lineup for their defense like Harrison Bader. So having a healthy Starling Marte would be massive for the New York Mets. And seeing him get better defensively on top of that too, because of that, seeing his health, how it might have affected him in the outfield where he did not grade out well last year, to maybe get into something a little bit closer to what we saw in 2022 on both sides. It's going to have a huge, huge impact on what this team can do this year. And if Marte and McNeil in particular get back to even 80% of what they gave the Mets in 2022, and you get the same production that you did last year out of Lindor, Nimmo, and Alonso, and then, of course, you maybe get that breakout or two from the young guys, I think this lineup comes together and could be very good. But if Starling Marte is banged up or out of the lineup altogether, and you're putting out an outfield of Harrison Bader, Brandon Nimmo, and Tyrone Taylor, I'd be pretty concerned about just the overall offense you're getting out of those 3 spots. There's other things that can happen. Jeff McNeil can slide into the outfield if you find someone better or someone capable of playing second base every day. That gives you an offensive jolt like a Acuna or a Jet Williams. There's Drew Gilbert who could maybe play in the outfield this season, but those are all questions on prospects. We saw last year, sometimes those top prospects come up and they don't necessarily hit the ground running. So having a veteran like Marte who has seen it all, done it all, and put up big numbers in the not too distant past here, that's huge for the Mets that he's healthy. So we'll see. We'll see if Marte can turn back the clock a little bit. The Mets could really use it. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. We'll have shows throughout the week as spring training continues here. It actually, picks up in full steam now, and games aren't that far away. So a lot of exciting stuff. If you don't want to miss out on any of your Locked On Mets coverage, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our bonus texting service where you can get updates from me anytime something breaks on the Mets. It's where you can ask me questions anytime. It's also where we're going to be running our giveaways throughout the year and also posting our lineups each day once the regular season starts. So you'll always know what the Mets starting 9 is before first pitch. If you want to be a part of our Locked On Mets Insider program, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. If you're listening to today's show on your podcast feed, make sure you follow, rate, and review. If you are watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We're within 100 subs from getting to our goal of 8,000 by opening day. So appreciate all of you who hit that subscribe. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day. Now for your second watch, head over to YouTube and find the first ever 24/7 streaming channel covering everything in the world of sports. I'm talking about Locked On Sports Today with our local experts from each team and our league-wide experts from each team. You'll find Locked On Sports Today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.